Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to our afternoon session. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce you to one of the most distinguished scholars in the field of Eurasian Neolithic, Prof.Dr. Detlef Gronenborn'un from the Römisch-Germanische Zentralmuseum in Mainz, the Research Institute for Prehistory and member of the Leibniz Foundation. Detlef completed his academic education in prehistoric archaeology, historic ethnology, history and archaeology of the Roman provinces at the University of Köln, Frankfurt, and Indiana University in Bloomington. He holds a Magister Artium, an MA, from the University in Frankfurt, and was a research fellow and lecturer with a special research project here in focusing on African archaeology for a change, cultural change of language, history in the West African savannah, here in the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main. Then in 1997 he became adjunct assistant professor at the University of Florida. He then embarked on his professorial thesis, the so-called Habilitation, here, which he also completed at the University in Frankfurt in the field of prehistoric archaeology, and after working as adjunct senior lecturer at the University of Frankfurt, Göttingen, Bamberg, and Mainz, he is currently working as a curator at the Römisch-Germanische Zentralmuseum in Mainz and is at the same time adjunct professor at the Johannes Gutenberg University at Mainz. So after dealing with the pre-pottery Neolithic and Neolithic realities and lives in the southeast of modern Turkey, Detlef will now take us much further to the west and see what's happening there during the course of the early Neolithic. Thank you very much for coming. It's a great pleasure for us. Detlef, the stage is yours.
First, I want to thank you, Thomas, for the invitation. It has been very interesting, fascinating, and pleasurable so far, except one small thing, which we will forget. In my presentation, I will take you from where our colleague has left us before lunch. He stopped with showing a similar map on the Neolithic expansion in Western Eurasia and said, all right, from central Anatolia onwards, or Anatolia onwards, the Neolithic spread westward, it spread eastward. Basically, it from there conquered the world. Just a little small background on where entirely in the entire world the Neolithic has happened. I think a map like this has not been shown, or I've missed it. These are there's 3 slides in German now, and all the others will be in English. None in Turkish, I'm afraid, but that's how it is. I think our interpreters will have to deal with this. This is a slide showing. We don't need to flip through all the different lines. It's a slide showing where all in the world plants of various kinds have been cultivated and domesticated. Of course, we here are on the fringes of the so-called Fertile Crescent, but you see that elsewhere in the world, a number of different plants have been domesticated. Those that made it to international modern-day economic importance are, for instance, maize in Central America, which has been domesticated around 6,700 BCE. Then, of course, all the varieties of rice. In Eastern Asia, there's different types of rice which have been domesticated at different periods in time. the East Asian rise 4,500 to 4,000 BCE, and then the Indian variety. From the Indian variety, we don't really know when exactly it has been domesticated. Then we have a number of other pineapple, for instance, American yams, but there's also African yams. The potato, which of course nowadays is very important, cucurbita, and then of course we all know banana, taro, and yams comes from East Asia. But when you look at the numbers, at the BCE numbers, you see that all this comes after the early domesticates in the Near East, in our region here, 9,500 to 8,500. The same is true that the Fertile Crescent is the cradle of the Neolithic globally, is also true for domesticated animals. Here the Americas are very poorly represented because there's hardly any animal in the Americas that could be domesticated. There's a variety of animals, but none prove to have the traits of animals that could be domesticated. The only domesticates that we have is the turkey, either in the southwestern United States or in Mexico. Then I don't even know the English term, Moschusente in German. It's a real ugly duck. You don't often see it. And then the llama and alpaca here in Peru. But that's all for the Americas. Also, Africa is badly represented. We have the African cattle and a little chicken type animal. Asia, we have an Asian cattle, which was domesticated for about 1,000 years, and then it died out. People did not domesticate cattle in Asia any further. Then we have the pig, or the Asian pig, the water buffalo, and the chicken here in India, the dromedar in the Arabian Peninsula, and then again the Fertile Crescent pops up. And my colleague has shown the picture here from CEDA 2008. We have sheep, goat, pig, and cattle, which have been domesticated at the earliest time globally. Before that, all people were hunter-gatherers. Here in the Fertile Crescent, we have, so to speak, the cradle of basically civilization, global civilization, because the domesticates that came from the Near East made it all across the world. They are nowadays economically important on any continent globally. This is another slide, unfortunately in German, but I want to just show you that while this is the blue shade is the end of the Ice Age, the Neolithic is basically, our colleagues have said that before, and I'm sure think that Lee Clare will also talk about it. The Neolithic basically is a human invention of the Holocene. There has been a great debate many years ago why Homo sapiens did not invent the Neolithic in the previous warm phase. The arguments have gone back and forth, but we can't really say why it didn't happen. But we know the Neolithic is basically farming and animal husbandry is basically an invention of our Holocene, of the warm period that we undergo right now. And you can see here from this graph that also here, which shows it a bit nicer, that also here this is early 10,000, so this is just at the end of the Ice Age. This is 1,000 after Christ. Sorry for the terminology, but I can't help it. I teach in Germany, and that's the terminology and the calendar we use. So I apologize, but recalculating it would be too much for me now here, I'm afraid. So the year 1000 AD, so we have 10,000, and you see that Zagros and Mesopotamia, so basically the Near East, is the earliest occurrence, again, globally, of farming societies. And as we've also heard from Mehmet Özdogan, farming is also, so to speak, the prelude to any urban civilization. And this can be taken simply from this graph, where we can see that urban civilizations, Mesopotamia here, starting around 4000, are the earliest also here in the Near East compared to any other regions in the world. For instance, South Africa, urbanization only appears shortly before 1000 AD. North America, the same thing. West Africa, the same thing. So Africa is very far behind in urbanization and also in domesticating. Mesopotamia and basically the region south of Gobeklitepe is the region where all this happens, and it is entirely something that happens during the Holocene. When we look globally at what domestication, what the Neolithic, and what urbanization produces, we can see that it is the foundation for any complex society. Societies with a political hierarchization, with temples, shrines, anything that is beyond a simple hunter-gatherer camp. And a good colleague, Herr Kohler, from the University of Arizona, has taken a statistical measure, which is also taken by any economic scientist, the Gini coefficient, to measure wealth differences in the Americas and in the Old World. And you can see that due to the early start of the Neolithic, of a producing society here in the Fertile Crescent is also the region where wealth differences within societies as an indicator for complexity, where wealth difference started first with Jarf el-Amar, and then here well-known Chatal Hüyük. They have not calculated Göbeklitepe, I think, because they're using habitation structures, and to my knowledge there are not really many habitation structures in Göbeklitepe. But you see Chatal Hüyük, it is also at the very beginning of social differentiation and social complexity, and then it goes the direction that we all know through our history classes in high school. It goes all the way up finally to Rome. I think Rome is not shown here anymore, but anyway. And you can also see, just on the side, that the new world, due to the late advent also of producing of Neolithic societies in the New World, they are very much behind compared to the Old World. It all, as Mehmet has said, it all started here. This is the very beginning that I'm talking about. There is also a component which is widely debated in science, which brings us right to the present day. We all know that today we have problems of global warming due to basically pollution. That's the basic factor. Increased warming, carbon dioxide exposure, and things like that. And there's one argument which has been made about 20 years ago by a certain gentleman, Ruddiman, who had found out that the greenhouse gases, which are important today, methane and carbon dioxide, these are two of the major greenhouse gases of major importance. Methane and carbon dioxide have left their natural time distribution compared to previous warm phases about 6,000 years ago, when exactly humans started to domesticate animals and to farm cereals. So the argument is, usually one would have predicted, if you compare all the warm phases, the 10 or 20 warm phases that go back a million or so years, then you can make a statistical behavior of how those greenhouse gases would have behaved naturally. That's the blue graph here for both, for methane and carbon dioxide. But you can see here that in our Holocene, the actual measurement of methane and of carbon dioxide differ from the natural projection. And the argument by Ruddiman is that already these simple farming societies, which have started here in this region and then expanded, have begun to have an impact on the Earth's greenhouse gas component. There has also been an argument that it already at that time influenced climate, but this is very debatable. But anyway, what we see is that already with the advent of farming, with the beginning of producing societies, with complex societies, that we have a global environmental impact. So there are good things about farming, and there are problematic things about farming. Another thing that I just briefly want to mention on the site, which I also find quite interesting, it's from a couple of years ago, a certain Herr Ruff has looked at the human skeletons of hunting and gathering populations and farming populations. And he found out that basically, globally, farming populations are leaner and less robust than hunting and gathering populations. Which means, on the counter side, that if you lead a hunter-gatherer life, your life is much hardier, sturdier, and, well, it requires a lot more bodily action. Whereas with farming, your body, your physical activities are reduced, and you develop a leaner, weaker stature. And if you look at hunting and gathering populations, these are archaeological samples, but if you look at hunting and gathering populations where they still live in central Amazonia or in parts of Andaman Islands or well, nowadays in Australia, you can see the same thing. These are generally more robust, sturdier populations. So that's the good thing about farming. It made us more comfortable, but also slightly weaker. And one last general thing, which I personally find quite interesting, farming also changes speech. As a hunter-gatherer, you eat meat and coarse cereal, coarse plants, which are not always processed quite well. So you need a very strong jawbone and a strong chewing apparatus. With farming, cooked foods, gruel and soft foods, the wonderful foods that we've eaten this afternoon, you know, very soft foods come up, and then the chewing apparatus sort of degrades, and the jawbone sort of deforms, and these people pronounce different sounds. So globally, again, hunter-gatherers do not use certain vocals like F and V, because they cannot really pronounce them, because they have a stronger jawbone. And with farming, these sounds can be pronounced. So farming is not only that we settle down, that we become more complex, that we have a political hierarchy and all these things. Farming also changes bodily and lastly also mentally, because one thing, and I've not shown this, one thing with farming, you have more people together in one group, which also requires a much more complicated social apparatus. If you just have 5 people to deal with, you can manage. But if you have 500 people to deal with, that's when the quarrel starts. And that's when you start to develop negotiation mechanisms and all these things that have finally led to our global political, social structure that we have today. So this was the introduction. How am I doing? Not too badly, I suppose. This was the introduction. We go back now, and as there have been a number of presentations which have dealt with the Near East, with Göbeklitepe and the surroundings, I have taken the liberty to show you what those farmers experienced and underwent that eventually expanded out of the Fertile Crescent across the Balkans and into Central Europe. So what I will be telling you about is nothing that happened here, but things that happened in wider Eurasia, and specifically here in this area, because as you can see here, and we know this now from genetics, we have a farming population with clear genetic signals from Anatolia, this is very much undoubted, which encounter a hunting and gathering of various hunting and gathering populations here in Eurasia, and which then form not only our modern European society, but we have also, a bit later, we have also a genetic backflow from these populations back into the area of modern day Turkey. I will not talk about it very much, but I can assure you the genetics the genetic literature that is being produced today show basically that even during the Ice Age, so I will show one graph, 15,000 years ago, we see genetic flow between Europe and Western Asia continuously, and we also see genetic flow across Eurasia and between Eurasia and the Near East. So there's never really a period, this is the graph, there is never really a period in the history of at least anatomically modern humans where we can say that a population is stable and indigenous to one region. That just doesn't exist. There's always people going and coming. Yeah, so this is the graph that I'm going to show. Well, we all came somewhere, deep out of Africa, presumably, that's what they tell us, about 40,000 years ago, across the East and then into Europe. But since then, as I said, we have a continuous eastward and westward movement of populations, but also of archaeological materials, showing that all these hunting and gathering populations, which have previously been understood as very local groups, but they all have supra-regional connections across Europe, but also across, not depicted here, also across into the Near East. One thing, and now I have to go into a little bit of detail, lithic detail, it's very specific. One thing that has been discussed for many years are changes that happened in Europe long before the advent of farming. And this is the sudden appearance of these type of so-called regular blades and those rectangular arrowheads. This is important also for the region here because that has been debated for Europe for many years. Even in the 1960s, the colleagues found out that there's a great rupture, a real great rupture in the Mesolithic stratigraphy in Europe, that all of a sudden we have an entirely new lithic industry. And the reason why this is also interesting for the region here is that this type of lithic industry also makes its appearance into eastern Anatolia around 8,300 BC. We've known of this for many years. We've observed this, we have mapped this. I've made this map several years ago. And what we can see is that these specific type of lithic, technology must have its origins somewhere in Mongolia 20,000 years ago. From there, the material or the technology spreads out for once, even to the Americas, and then also westward. It makes, as I said, its appearance here into Anatolia at 8,300, and about 2,000 years later also here into Western Central Europe. So it is something, it's an archaeological signal that comes out of deep Asia and then ventures into the Near East and and basically Western Eurasia. We can fix it chronologically quite well. I've said already. We have the early Mesolithic, so the previous technology, and then the late Mesolithic, of these arrowheads that I just showed, and they are mutually exclusive. So the basic idea was that probably there had been a population change. The geneticists had never believed that because they couldn't find it, but now they do. We have pre-Neolithic population movements out of Asia into Anatolia and also into Eastern Europe. So it's not only that the Neolithic people migrated, it's also the hunting and gathering people migrated. That's what I said before. We have population exchanges across Eurasia all the time since the Holocene. Interestingly enough, although I've been in doubts about the climatic impacts on migration movements, but funnily enough, these migration movements can be aligned to a period of unfavorable climate across Eurasia. That's a bit of a detail here. I've presented this for Lee. We can discuss later on over a beer. But that's not all. That's not all. And I've been thinking all the time that I've sat here and listened to the presentations. You've heard from all my colleagues that you have the pre-Pottery Neolithic A and the pre-Pottery Neolithic B, indicating that there's a Neolithic without pottery. And we have known for 20 years or more that, well, even until since the 1950s, that the Neolithic, the early Neolithic evolves without pottery. However, hunting and gathering populations in Eastern Asia, many thousand kilometers away, many thousand kilometers away in Eastern Asia, have pottery 20,000 years ago, before or with the beginning of the peak of the Ice Age. And from then onwards, many hypotheses, but the picture gets better. From then onwards, we see a diffusion of these pottery traditions across the Eurasian steppe belt into the forest belt, leaving out the Near East. These are all these pointed vessels. And we have pottery in Europe, or in southeastern Europe, as a part of European Russia, which is older than the pottery here in the Near East. And I would not be surprised, and in fact there's just a publication out, I would not be surprised that one day we will at least be able to hypothesize a bit stronger that pottery was maybe invented locally, but also brought in from these hunting and gathering populations in Eurasia. But that's something that we need to talk about. The argument comes indeed here from this recently, just a few weeks ago, this recently published article by Feldman et al. In Nature Communications. Really, I've just seen it last week, and they have looked at the genomes in Near Eastern, Indian, and European populations. And what I hope you can see is that at 8,200 BCE, that there is a population influx from Central Asia into this region here. Hitherto unknown. I leave that open to the debate, that's just out now, but I remind you of the lithic technology that also came from Central Asia. So exactly at that time we see this genetic signal. So there seems to be a strong component of people coming from this real huge landmass of Central Asia into Eastern Anatolia. And another detail that I just want to point out is that a bit later, around 7000 BCE, we see population exchange between the Levant and central Anatolia. But why I wanted to show you this is that this article basically is concerned with whether farming here in central Anatolia was adopted, like it was said before, by an immigrant population from the Levant, but that does not seem to be the case. We see that the genetic signals of the local hunter-gatherer population and the early farming population is more or less the same. They all cluster here. So we know that in central Anatolia and eastern Anatolia, there weren't, with the beginning of farming, there weren't any big population movements, but farming was adopted more or less by the local hunting and gathering population. Just to show you how far these huge Eurasian contacts go, you need to switch and go to the other side of the Mediterranean, into Spain. There we have a local Mesolithic individual, which was buried deep inside a cave. It has the typical signature of what the geneticists call the Western hunter-gatherers. But within this individual, we can see that these individuals have their relations, genetic relations, also in populations in East Asia. So this connection between East Asia and Western Eurasia goes as far as the Iberian Peninsula. Again, it shows that there have been massive connections between widely dispersed populations before the Neolithic and during the end of the last ice age and into the first 4,000 years of the Holocene. Archaeologically, we had known this many years ago because these polished cells, a typical indication of Neolithic societies, have been found in Central European sites long before the advent of the Neolithic, 6,200 BCE, that is 1,000 years before the early farmers came from Anatolia, and these polished cells have their artifactual correspondence, so similar addresses are found throughout Eurasia. So also archaeologically we can see that these populations have been in contact, and that's another indicator. Those snails again are plotted. Turkey is left out because I wanted to focus on Europe, but you can see that also with the bodily decoration, we can see that these simple hunting and gathering populations had extensive networks across the entire continent. And there's also other works done by colleagues for Anatolia. You can see that also these hunting and gathering populations did have these huge and wide and continent-wide networks, really. I want to focus briefly on this. This is the first pottery implement, real pottery implement that has been found in Western Europe. It's a seal, it's a stamped seal, which is a typical artifact of the early farming populations here in the Balkans. And with this, so to speak, we can see that the early farmers are becoming a component of this huge genetic pool that Western Eurasia really constitutes. I like this picture, although it's a bit outdated. It basically shows that we have three population components. One in the west, composed of Western hunter-gatherers of Ice Age ancestry. One here in the east, hunting and gathering populations with links far into Asia, and then the advent of the farmers from basically Anatolia. And this is what this graph also shows. We have the western hunter-gatherers, that's the blue plot here. We have the eastern hunter-gatherers, these are the green people. And then we have the farmers from Anatolia, which come into Europe through the Balkans. And that's what I will be focusing on right now. Thomas has asked me to talk a little bit about climate, or he's asked me to talk about climate, not knowing that I switched my entire reasoning about the role of climate. I will come to this point at the very end, after we've gone flipped through some images of the experience of the farming population in Europe. But many years ago, I have produced a previous image like this, and Lee is also, was also quite in agreement. Yeah.
I'd like to see what you say.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to see what you say.
Yeah, it comes at the very end. We were about 10 years ago. We were of the opinion that the expansion of this farming population into Europe, basically as it is, into Europe, was sort of driven by climate pulses, by periods of bad and unfavorable climate unfavorable to farming societies. So these farming societies grew, then the climate became bad, and they had to look for better areas to continue their population and farm. That was the simple model. They have published much more sophisticated articles. I have published simple articles, but the idea is basically the same. So it's a stepwise progression driven by climate. That was 10 years ago, 15 years ago even, when we had not very good climate data, only the coarse data that I showed. And nowadays, with much more higher resolution data, it shows that this simple assumption is not true as it was phased. There might still be something to it, I will come to it at the very end, but it now shows that the process was much more differentiated. There is a publication by Flohr et al. In 2016, and then Weniger et al. Was also a member of the team. And they're sort of contradicting. Flohr et al. Say that climate had no major impact, and that the societies were basically resilient to even grave climate changes. Weniger and also myself at the time said, okay, but here and there we see that climate did have an effect. The truth is, as always, somewhere in between. Climate sometimes has an effect, but it does not have an overall effect. I think we can agree on this. Good. I believe that my colleague is in agreement. That was my greatest fear. But nevertheless, we can say, for whatever reason, these populations, the farming populations, came out from Anatolia. As you can see here, this is a bit outdated, but it's the best graph that there is still in the literature. These people, basically early farmers, came from Anatolia across the Mediterranean as well, but basically into Central Europe, and built those magnificent farming societies that we see in Central Europe. And now, that was the second part of the introduction. Now we come to the, not to the conclusion yet, so I still do have some time, not to the conclusion yet, but I will tell you a little bit about the experience of these farming populations in Central Europe. So they came through, we'll start here with the first scheme. They came through, jumped, so to speak, from Western Anatolia to Greece and the Balkans, and from then they moved up into Southeastern Europe, the so-called Starchevo culture, when they came to a halt again, and then the first farmers of Central Europe formed out of an immigrant population with Anatolian genetic ancestry and a component of about maximum 10% of local hunter-gatherers right here in Hungary. And this mixed population then spread and sort of brought the Neolithic into Europe. Depending on where you look, There are some regions where the population is even 100% of Anatolian genetic ancestry, but the hunter-gathering population never exceeds 10%. So it's basically an immigrant population that brings farming into Europe, and then, I will explain this further on, and then out of these early farmers, through increasing contact with local hunting and gathering populations, through increasing contacts, a complex array of archaeological cultures evolves during the Middle Neolithic and then during the Young Neolithic, where I will stop because thereafter we have another population influx from the Asian steppe regions, which sort of cut off all the previous developments and brings about new change. But this is then an entirely different story. So I've already talked about this. Anatolian population comes, forms the starchable courage culture, and then gets into contact with hunting and gathering populations here. These undergo an enormous, really not understood population increase. You know, these people must have bred like mad, because they begin to form villages and then expand into Central Europe from here, and they cover their landscape, cover the landscape with their farming villages. As I said, throughout, again, this goes into lithics, no pottery, lithics. What we can say from the arrowheads, we see that while we have indication of biological admixture, as the geneticists say, between populations here, we still see cultural exchange with local hunter-gatherers as the farmers went westward, but not any biological exchange anymore. So we have a population that forms here and stays rather homogeneous while they meet populations of local hunting and gathering ancestry, but they apparently did not mix biologically, only much later here in France. That's an interesting component which just springs up in the past, well, several months, that we have different approaches by these Anatolian population to the different local Mesolithic populations in Europe. Why that is, we don't know, but we see it. So people have behaved quite differently to their neighbors. One archaeological correlate of a clear immigration from Hungary to the west, if we didn't have the genetics, is this lithic material. Again, it's a certain type of radiolarite. We've heard about obsidian all the time. We don't have obsidian in Central Europe. We have this material. This comes here from Hungary, and it is transported as far as Frankfurt. That's 900 kilometers. There was no economic reason to use this raw material from Hungary here, but this must have been something that the people felt attracted to. It is quite peculiar because of this red color, but the people must have felt attracted to it because this is their region of origin. This is where they came from, where this material has used, and they have used this material even in Frankfurt. Quite interesting. Another thing, let me just see how it goes on. Another thing that also comes up very recently is how the villages of the immigrant farmers were composed. And this is a huge village. You can see here the ditch around the village. And a colleague of mine has plotted certain symbols on ceramics. And it appears that these certain symbols are exclusive depending on the individual wards. So the idea is that we have an immigrant component of farmers, which basically build the village, and we have people of local hunting and gathering ancestry who also lived in the village, but they never interacted biologically. This village stood there for 500 years, so we have an immigrant population, and even the next ward, the next quarter, people live of a different genetic ancestry, and they live day to day in that village of a few hundred meters for 500 years without biological contact. That is something which is quite interesting. You know, when you think of immigrant populations and how they isolate themselves and how they distinguish themselves from others, yet live with them, even in these small villages, for 500 years. This village has a chronology of 500 years. And it also seems that they have very different patterns of land use. Some had access to farmable land, and others had access to land in a greater distance. That tells an interesting story about basically 7,000 years ago, immigrant populations and local populations interacted in Central Europe. Another component here, again, lithics is shown basically here. We have the immigrant population, and we not only have local hunting and gathering population, we also have populations from far distances. We see this from import finds. So these farming villages were not only attractive to local populations, but also to populations living very, very far, several hundred and sometimes 1,000 kilometers away. They came to the farming villages, they interacted, traded, exchanged, whatever, but never interacted biologically. They waited after whatever they did, they went their different ways into their different worlds. Only after the culture of these early farming, it's, by the way, it's called Lydia pottery culture, of these early farmers, only afterwards do we see that the local hunting and gathering population has a stronger impetus on the farming villages. So we have first a huge blur of people coming. They stood very homogeneous for 500, 600 years, a very closed society, and after this society collapsed in a period of warfare, after this society collapsed, it is then that they accept, so to speak, the local outsiders in their societies. And this has to be taken from this graph. Unfortunately, it was not made for a PowerPoint, but you can see that basically we have the hunting and gathering population is blue, and then we have incoming farmers, which are orange, and then after the early incoming farmers, we see that the population becomes more and more mixed. So when you look at the genetic mixture of a period 1,000 years after the advent of the early farmers, you see mixed genomes. So that's then when the people began to interact biologically, as it is. I find this quite fascinating. You have a closed population come in, and for 1,000 years, these people stood amongst themselves. They knew the others, but I think after a while they also talked to each other because the languages were quite different. By the way, they looked also quite different. After 1,000 years, then only they begin to also mingle biologically. Okay, and when they begin to mingle biologically, this is the period of the so-called Middle Neolithic, when these entire early Neolithic blur breaks apart and small regional cultures emerge. It's a time that is also called the Jade Age or the Copper Age. The Jade Age is my terminology. Copper Age is a more traditional terminology. Jade Age is because jade was very important in the regions in Western Europe, France, for instance, and I will show you an example, and becomes an important item, whereas copper, obviously here, in Anatolia and in Eastern Europe was much more important. What we have are simple farming societies, but we have site hierarchies, and we have status markers and elite and marked social hierarchies. There was one slide missing here. I've added it. I apologize because I've had another slide similar to this showing the characteristics of the early farmers. These were also simple farming, but they had no site hierarchies and no status markers. So they were a very equal society, so to speak. But that breaks up, and with the succeeding Neolithic, we have then status markers and considerable political differentiation. And it is at this time, as I said before, it is at this time that we see archaeologically and also genetically that the hunter-gathering population somehow makes their way into the farming population, and that they are buried side by side. Before, the farmers buried their people in a certain ritual, and these are all Anatolian-based ancestries, and now hunting and gathering populations. But with the burial grounds of this period, we see a much more hunting and gathering people artifacts and hunting and gathering admixture, biological admixture in this population. This is, as I said, the Jade Age or the Copper Age. It's a step increase in complexity in Neolithic societies. We have the first gold here in Varna. We have copper artifacts all across Eastern Europe, far into Western Europe. Those copper presumably, well, there's a great debate, academic debate, whether copper we've seen some copper from Anatolia yesterday. Mehmet showed me whether the copper smelting technology eventually came from Turkey to what's the situation now?
Very different.
Okay. So, but anyway, so Eastern Europe was characterized by copper artifacts, so metal was being produced. Metal requires a certain technological sophistication and complex society. And on the other side, jade was complex. But I wanted to show you these slides here from Varna. Gold. Burials with gold, high status burial individuals, lavishly decorated with gold objects, and this is something that is totally different from what we have before in the entire history of humanity, I must say. We have here now at 4,500 BCE, across Western Eurasia, more in Europe than in Anatolia, I believe, do we see that a few certain individuals are elevated so much that their burials are extremely different from the commoner population. And we also have in this era, in this period, the evidence of slaves. So we have a society which is extremely differentiated and led by individuals with access to, at that time, enormous wealth. And this happens for the first time in human history. For the first time, you must make this clear to yourselves. Never before have societies been so differentiated. Throughout the Paleolithic now, throughout the early Neolithic now, only then, in the 5th millennium BCE, do we see that this all of a sudden happens. And it is based, as I've shown in my introduction, it is really based on the processes that come along with farming and the surplus and the population increase that it all produces. So the slide that I've shown from Kola can also be shown for Europe. Enormous wealth differences, and we see, funnily enough, we see Europe is sort of split in two. One is characterized by jade artifacts, and the eastern half is characterized by copper and gold artifacts. So we see sort of a polarization, also of an economic polarization of the entire continent. And genetically, where the jade exists, we have more hunting and gathering populations being brought into these farming populations than where the copper is. So where the copper is, these populations are genetically slightly more homogeneous. It's not only Varna that we have these in Bulgaria that we have these enormously rich burials. It's also here in central France. This is a burial from the Paris Basin. We have a long, extremely long mound, produced only for 2 individuals, but it took several hundred people for 3 weeks or so to shovel this mound. You know, that has also never happened before. 300 people, what is that, 100 people for 3 weeks. You know, these people have to be freed from other work and daily tasks. They got together to shovel a grave for 2 people. Never before in the history of humanity has this happened. In Paris, this is another burial from Central Europe. It also shows that these individuals were much more richly decorated than the burials before. So wealth difference as an effect, of farming also happens in Western Eurasia. We have hardly any figurines, unlike the Fertile Crescent. We have hardly any figurines of this period, so we don't know how these politically leading figures represented themselves, except for an area west of Paris where they have engraved themselves in stone. You can see this is the height of a normal person with the cylinders of the little taller, but you can see this is a supernatural size of an individual, and it shows these eerie eyes, probably with a beard, and it shows these strange things. So previously, people thought these were some kinds of feathers, but there's no natural bird in Europe. You know, we have pheasants, but pheasants have not existed at the time. So there's no bird that would have feathers this long. So we think that these are rather sort of power radiance that goes out from this individual. That goes out from this individual. So these political figures not only managed to bring themselves up on top of the societies and made hundreds of people work for them and bury them, they also managed to tell people that they have some kind of supernatural aura, that they're more powerful than others, that they have maybe access to whatever powers, and they symbolize this with these power rays. This looks like sort of like a comic figure, but the eyes are meant to sort of to penetrate those that observe. And because I will be showing those, there are these jade axes depicted here. These were a symbol of this supernatural, religious, political leading figure. Across France, in the western half of France, we have these burial mounds in which these politically leading figures were buried. They culminate sort of in Brittany, so very, very far away from here, at the Atlantic coast. There's the Tumulus de Toumiac, a huge burial mound, 86 by 20 meters, dating to around 4,500 BCE, and it has all these lavish artifact materials, jade from the Alpines and other precious stones from the Iberian Peninsula. So if you see this burial, nowadays it would have to be a person buried with 10 or 15 high-ranking Mercedes, to equivalent the wealth. This individual has in the amount of work that went into the burial, the amount of work that went into the burial, and the material that was buried within is the highest accumulation of wealth in one single location that we have for this period. It's a peak of enormous wealth that went into this burial, and it sort of signifies the political maybe also economic, I'll come to this, economic and religious power. And the Celts, our French colleagues say that they have something to do with warfare, because certain American Indian tribes also use this symbolism. So it's the Jade Axe is a symbol of wealth, of power, and of sort of religious supremacy of these individuals. Again, nowadays this doesn't sound so surprising. We know political situations where this happens nowadays, but at that time it was the first period that ever this happened in humanity. We ask ourselves, if you talk to people, I'm the religious leader, I can do strange things, that's okay, but there has to be some economic wealth, people have to live on something. And one thing that has been debated is that part of the wealth of these individuals across Europe, in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe, derives from the fact that they live along the coastlines. It's interesting to see that it's all, the concentration of wealth is on the coastlines, and it is coastlines where still today salt is being produced. So the idea is that these people, these coastal people, produced salt and transported it inland, where salt was in demand by the farmers for the capital. So again, it's something that could have only evolved with farming people, because hunting and gathering people take their salt from the meat they eat. They don't need extra salt sources. But as soon as you have cattle, you need extra salt also for conserving the meat and everything. So salt becomes a commodity of extreme value in these societies. It has until the Middle Ages. Today we tend to forget about it because we go to the store or to the supermarket and buy salt, but at that time salt was sort of like what oil is today. It kept the entire economy going. So the basis of this extreme wealth might have been salt, and that again relates to farming societies. We not only have, at these times, we not only have the political leading figures, we also have evidence of those that were very unfortunate. And here again comes the interplay between the immigrant populations of, lastly, Anatolian genetic ancestry and the local hunter-gatherers. We have one site here in the middle Paris Basin, and we can see that the population that was buried here in this burial ground had many different genetic ancestries. It were Mesolithic or pre-farming populations of the local stock. It had Anatolian farming ancestry coming into here from the west through the Neolithic cultures in Central Europe, and it had also mixed Neolithic hunting-gatherer ancestry coming from the south of France. So basically what you have here are societies which become a melting pot. Before the societies, for 1,000 years, the societies were largely, or kept themselves largely apart. They interacted, but they never integrated. Here now these societies become integrated and interbreeding begins. And this then takes us to the next period, to Michelsberg, where out of these genetically multi-component societies, we see a new dynamic coming out, which then from the west expands into the east. Not as far as Anatolia, this happens a little later, but as I said, these societies that form in France or in Central Europe make their way then back to the region here. So we have a big shift after the Ice Age of people coming from Anatolia to Europe, and then later on we have sort of a backflow, people going back again to Anatolia. Michelsberg, the Young Neolithic, is a society, again, very different from the previous societies. We have agro-pastoralists, we have clear site hierarchies, we have status markers, we have clear elites, marked social hierarchies. And I wanted to show you this site, because this is the site I work on. I'm not as far, because I've just discovered it 10 years ago, I'm not as far as you guys are with Gobeklitepe, but we're getting there. It's also an enormous site, it is well preserved, and I'm going to show you a few slides. If you happen to have a stopover in Frankfurt on some occasion, please do visit the site. It's out there in the Taunus Mountains, and it's lovely situated. We're going to install an interpretive path, assume, so you can go there and entertain yourself and see what basically people from Anatolia then created 2,000 years later in Europe. I find this interesting, but I studied this. Okay, as I said, this society here emerged, components from Anatolia, southern France, and Mesolithic people here in the Paris Basin, and then moved westwards. We have evidence again of high-ranking individuals. So it is this stratified society. But what we have now is a very complex network of regional interaction in which salt plays a role. These are the Central European salt sources, because we have salt at the Atlantic coast and we have salt in Central Europe. And this has been important until the Middle Ages, and this system evolved at that time, that people expanded eastwards to grasp or to have a hold on these salt sources from Central Europe, because it was important for their cattle herds. What they exchanged for this salt, because it was so valuable to them, were these jade axes. So we see hordes of jade axes near the salt sources. So basically these people, let's make a simplistic scenario, they came with their jade axes on the shoulder, and then put the jade axes, and then they got salt for their cattle and went back. And what also emerged in the course of this very complex, interaction system, are the first economic freeways that exist. If you have been to Germany, if some of you might have been, you know the German autobahns, the freeways. These roads, 6,000 years ago, are nearly the same way that our German autobahns go now. They have evolved at that time, and they existed through the Roman and the medieval long-distance way system, and most of them evolved into what the German autobahn system is right now. So people living in Germany know that's the A3, always clogged, Cologne here, always traffic problems, maybe not at the time, but it was the road network evolved here at the time, and it was maintained by the need of salt and the fact that they brought jade axes from France to Central Europe. What you also see here is that slaves were captured, and indeed it seems that this system here was a very complex and aggressive system that took up slave populations on its vicinity. There's a number of archaeological indications for this. I will come to one soon. Apart from this dense network of road systems that evolved, we also have a complex site hierarchy. We have huge sites of up to 100 hectares where people came together. So around 3,700, again, we see a huge global Western Eurasian population increase, and we see early proto-urban structures emerging from Mesopotamia up until the Atlantic coast. And Central Europe is just part of this dynamic. Why we see these population increase is not really clear, but the farming technique might have been one component of this. One site that has become important in interpreting this is the Kapsamında north of Frankfurt. It's a huge site, 24 hectares of interior occupation space. and we calculate between 720 and 900 inhabitants at the time. So this was the population density of these huge sites in Central Europe. If you go to Ukraine, you see villages with 10,000 and more people at that time. So we have, it's another step in the evolution of civilization, if you will, that we see here with people coming together for longer periods in these huge settlements. One thing I'm still so excited about it because we just discovered it 4 months ago, which I wanted to share, is this burial mound right here on top of the site. The burial mound has a jade axe in it, and this again shows that these people that came from the Paris Basin sort of brought their valuables and their political structure and their way of disposing of the political and representing the political leaders, that they took this up in France and brought it into Central Europe. Another indication of really populations moving backward, not from east to west as before, but now from west to east. This is the burial mound. It's 90 by 6 meters. An impressive structure. Funnily enough, we now also see another shift in the Neolithic, in the structure of the Neolithic. We see also in temperate Europe the evolution of what we call agropastoralism. For reasons we don't yet understand, these people are not the permanent farmers anymore with their plots being maintained over many generations, but these people stay in their villages for 10 to 20, sometimes 50 years, and then they break the village apart and move elsewhere. And then many generations they come back. So they have a very volatile, they have a very volatile agripastoral system, which sort of seems to contradict these huge settlements that they build, but that's something that we yet need to understand. In fact, European folk history has no economic system that can be compared to it, and I had to go to East Africa really to see how these societies function. But you see, all this is something that evolved here in the Fertile Crescent and undergoes many transformations. And I've talked about the slavery. This is the site of Guggenheim in Alsace, and there's the site of Bruchsal in Germany. What you see in Guggenheim and in Bruchsal is multiple burials with one individual buried properly in the middle, and the others are dumped into the individual. None of them show real trauma on the bones, but you know, you can kill a person just without hurting him, hurting on the bone structure. So we have a central individual buried properly, like here, and then individuals that were just dumped into the pit. And it so turns out, and this is an interesting story, it so turns out that the individuals that are buried properly to speak, in the center are always of Anatolian ancestry. And the ones around might have Anatolian ancestry, but many of them also have a hunting and gathering ancestry. So it appears that these incoming farmers, after then they had begun to mingle with the population, nevertheless have had a very rigid society in which the rights to politically leading position was very much restricted to those people that ultimately, by then 2,000 years ago, came from Anatolia. That's one of the most interesting social archaeological revelations that we've had in the recent years. So these people were very hierarchically organized and very rigid in their access to rights. So we can now say that around that time we have a society very equivalent to what the Spaniards found in North America. We have a society in which we have leading positions, which have access to enormous wealth, these J-axes. Then we have a group of free, of which we don't know very much. And then we have a group of probably slaves and war captives that had no rights really to their own position. And these were dumped either in these burials or even in pits and dilapidated there with dogs gnawing on the bones. Situations which we know from medieval periods in Africa, or modern periods in Africa, where the slaves were dropped on the outside the villages, and the hyenas were eating from them. That would have been a situation in a Neolithic village in Europe 4,000 years ago. We can stop here if you want, or I can add.
Wrap it up.
There's another component on the climate and the social component. So I've now given you the social. You said 1 hour and a half.
Yeah. At least 1 hour.
Okay. No, in one way you said 1 hour and a half.
Oh, okay.
I've taken that now. I'll be done soon. I've said climate was not a trigger before. So the question then is, if climate was not a trigger, what was then? And for this, we've looked very detailed into these early farmers, because we have a lot of archaeological materials, and I've already shown you example that we have a lot of information on the social structure, on social identity. So we have taken this material and we grouped it theoretically into social identity within groups, and we find various levels of identity. You find the identity of the individual with the next higher ranking group, which is the clan or the lineage, or the family, the wider family, and then we have levels of identity where families or entire groups identify themselves with the greater group as a whole. And all this, interesting enough, has been inscribed on pottery, fortunately enough. It's one of the few examples. And when we plot this on a timeline, we can see how these identities undergo certain dynamics. And we've come to the conclusion that just as today, these early farming societies also underwent periods of a high group cohesion. These societies understood themselves as being belonging all together. Then these societies became more and more and more diverse. This then reached a tipping point, and then these societies went back to a more rigid social cohesion. I've shown you a lot of examples here throughout my lecture. So this basic pattern that we find repeatedly in societies up until this very day, the global world right now is somewhat here in this path. But we also see this in these early farming societies, and we think that these social dynamics, mechanism as it is, produce the succession of these archaeological cultures. So as a way of strong identity, diluting identity, strong identity, and then the next cycle comes up. And this can be found repeatedly throughout Europe, as I've just shown you, but it can also quite well explain the entire process of the dispersal of these Neolithic peoples. And to do away with the climate thesis, we've just in press an article where we've taken 50,000 various data, and it came out that climate only on 3 occasions explains not more than 20% of the population variability that we see. So climate is unimportant. Generally, and on 3 occasions it becomes 20% of the variability is explained by climate. Everything else, 80%, is explained by social dynamics. So it's the social dynamics that basically, as from these early farming societies on until this very day, determines the fate of history.
Detlef Gronenborn, thank you very much for this fascinating, partly sensational insights into the world beyond the Anatolian Neolithic. You can switch that on again, yep. Probably.
I would.
And I think we're happy to take questions and comments from the audience. There's the first one coming up.
Hello.
In English. Hello, my name is Ali. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I have a question. I think also it is related from your last points that you emphasized about social dynamics. I am wondering about the structure of the family, if there was a family system or a kind of family system, and if there was there any difference between hunting and gathering population, and also if we say like in the Neolithic age? For example, Levi Strauss, American anthropologist, as far as I know, he emphasized that the beginning of the civilization, for example, comes from the first repression of the incest, the law of the incest. Was there, I mean, do you have any interpretation? Because also yesterday I asked about this question when the presentation about Göbeklitepe. Still, they said that the professor said they didn't have this kind of information. My idea, this question came from my wondering, like, for example, in the Australian Aborigines, among them, as far as I know, there wasn't a marriage among the relatives. But for example, in the southeast now, sometimes we see like there is a marriage, maybe among the cousins, or so. I am wondering about that. If we hypothesis that there is also a relation, for example, like from the Neolithic age, like until now, maybe. You know, I don't know if my question is concrete.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It's a very good question.
Thank you.
It's a very good question. But the problem is, just like my colleague yesterday, we have only very sparse evidence. You need quite an amount of skeletons and burial grounds to deal with this question. So this rules out the hunting and gatherers because we hardly have any burials. They are always buried in single sites, so we have one individual which we accidentally find, and this one individual for 10,000 kilometers and 10,000, well, not 10,000 years, but so we don't know anything about their family structure, but we do know a little bit about the family structures of the early farmers in Central Europe, because we have a lot of burials there. What we see is that it is a paternal heritage system. So the wealth, the house, is inherited by the leading male in the family. And we see generally, and this persists through time, that the women often come in from the outside. So not even from the same village, but from the outside. You can tell from teeth. You know, your teeth are built in layers. What you eat as a young person is being stored, and then you can sort of see the geological record of your moving. And if you do that, you see that the leading males have always a local signal. So they, maybe they went out with the cattle or something, but they stayed with the house. Whereas many females, not all, but many females were grown up elsewhere and then married into the village. That does not mean that they were total strangers. They could come from the same wider lineage, but further away from another village. But we don't have evidence for this incest. And from the ethnographic evidence that I know is that people, wherever they can, are very careful to avoid this, because they know the consequences. The genetic, and we all know the consequences. If you come, I come from a small village.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Shakir. You ended up your presentation saying that the migration from Anatolia to Central Europe was not because of climate changes mainly, but it was because of social dynamics. What do you mean by social dynamics? Was there other tribes pushing the Anatolian people from their homes to thousands of kilometers away from their home, which was a very fertile land in the first place?
This graph. From what we know is, and there are historians who've looked at modern societies or medieval societies, that societies undergo certain social mechanisms. They form as a society at point A, then they consider themselves as very belonging together, and this then evaporates in the course of time. I can show you many timelines where you can exactly see that something that was part of the original identity then disappears, and they become more and more complex and diverse, and then at the very end of this cycle they become very rigid again. They start fighting each other, and a new identity emerges out of this cycle. We found those at the early farming societies, but a colleague of mine who has looked at the American society of the last 300 years, he had found exactly the same mechanism. He has also found smaller cycles of 50 years duration. We can't find those here in this archaeological material. So it's a dynamic of societies operating together, but then basically falling apart out of themselves. I've just, before I came, I've put in a proposal where we want to use mathematical modeling, whether sort of in a theoretical fishbowl, we can model societies without any external influx, and see whether this pattern really repeats itself in a theoretical sphere. But yeah, basically, it's very simple. Many historiographers have talked about this. It's nothing that we invented. We've only found the first cycles. Now, if you think about it, even European history, Turkish history, you also see these grand cycles of social cohesion, then social dispersion. Social cohesion is like societies, and I think this was one major component also in the Neolithic expansion.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very nice and enlightening presentation. I just wanted to know if jade and, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear, yeah.
If jade and copper use could tell us that there was a distinction between Anatolian farmers and the West Coast inhabitants, hunters and gatherers.
That is a very good question. I'm not saying this just out of politeness, because one could actually stretch the evidence to this direction. Copper is more towards the east, and jade is there where we have an increase in the population in western hunter-gatherers. Whether this is the actual reason is unclear, because also jade exists in the Alpine mountains and copper is far away. The French copper is very deep in mountains, so it has been explored very much later. So there's also an economic component to this, but it happens, you know, that, yeah, that there's a certain overlap between the distribution, the genetic distribution, and these two material distributions, but only to a certain extent.
I just would like to inform you that I have come across information in the specs this summer that from Wisconsin, very close to Madison, there's this Astolan, settlement, let's say, 9,000 BC. And they were really sort of doing copper trade, bring it down through the Mississippi River to Mexico, and from Mexico shipping it to Asia Minor.
I know Western quite well. I've been there several times.
You have?
Yes, I have. I know the colleagues there, and they dated 1200 AD, so it's medieval.
Well,
that's the information I have.
That was the information I have. Okay, thank you. We can discuss it later.
This was a very nice catchword, because this gives me very briefly the opportunity to comment on this copper question and or antiquarian idea that well, copper metallurgy was conceived and invented in Anatolia or the Near East in general, and then diffused to Eurasia and beyond. Like many other ideas, we have to abandon this ex oriente lux, this whatever innovation comes from the East idea now since the past years, or at least since the past decades, for sure. Well, the point is, with this very early copper working, which we also saw yesterday and the colleagues talked about, with little beads and pendants coming from Çayönü, for example, Aşıklıhöyük in central Turkey. Yet indeed, this is solid copper, but it's not real metallurgy, because people do not really understand that it's a different material than stone. They treat it the same way as they treat stone. They hammer it to bring it into shape, and then they anneal it, so they heat it in the fire. This is not smelting. They heat it in the fire to shape it more easily. People did the same thing with flintstone and obsidian for the same reasons, to shape it more easily. The great breakthrough with copper working and the conception, a very different approach to copper, and the understanding that it's a very different material from, than stone, that it's very malleable, that it's much more versatile, that you can liquefy it and pour it into shape and make all kinds of great things with it that you cannot do with stone. This was conceived, we can date this quite precisely here, in Anatolia, 5000 BC, and we can even give it a precise level and site. That was Mersin Yumuktepe, layer 14. 5000 BC, the first smelting is successfully achieved. So the liquefying of copper, real smelting, and then one thing, yes, from now on metallurgy flourishes. But the punchline here is, the fun fact is that metallurgy is conceived and then nothing happens. For 1,500 years, Anatolia is silent. So it's invented, it's conceived there, but then nothing happened. And it's obviously reintroduced or triggered by developments coming from the Balkans. So this technological innovation is conceived, it's performed, 5000 BC, then for 1500 years it's obviously kept like a very dangerous secret, because we have extremely few sites, if any, that we can date precisely, which really show signs of copper processing, of extractive metallurgy. But then only the mid-4th millennium BC, we again have a flourishing copper production and consumption in Anatolia, but this time obviously triggered from the Balkans. That aside, smelting is not really invented for the first time here in Anatolia. It was thought for a long time, but we have other sites like Belovode in Serbia or Tel Saf in modern Israel, which also found out that copper can be liquefied even 300-400 years earlier than Anatolia. So it seems to be an independent invention. It seems to be an independent observation that you can treat copper in a very different way you treat stone. Sorry for this very extensive comment, but thank you very much. More questions and comments coming up?
I just would like to correct myself. You are right, Castellan is much later, but it is the Tyrannina culture. That was 9000 BC. Thank you.
There was, yes, one more comment here from the back. Thank you.
Thank you for the very nice presentation. What I don't really get my head around is, why do these people immigrate from warmer climates such as Göbeklitepe or Anatolia to the northern Europe, where, thank you for the invitation to Frankfurt, but I wouldn't come until the summer to your site, where the winter and the cold weather is more of a bigger challenge to these people with no boots or coats such as ourselves at this time. I mean, why don't they migrate to warmer weather for whatever reason they're migrating? Why to Northern Europe?
Well, all I can say is that it was warmer in Frankfurt when I left 2 days ago than it was when I came here. It was freezing last night, I put the heater on. And then I thought, I said, yeah, I can see that. You know. No, I don't know. There's of course a great debate. You know, one thing that we always forget is that they not also went westwards, but they also went eastwards. So they basically went out of this area and expanded. And they had expanded because there's this population pressure. Even if they were not, compared to us, not that many, but still there were many more people than hunting-gathering populations have. And they could not go much further south because even at the time there was the desert. So, you know, going westward is basically the way to go.
But why not Mediterranean basin then?
They also went to the Mediterranean.
Yeah, but we basically dealt with the Central Europe, right?
Yeah, that's because I work there. Where's the first slide? Yeah, here you go. Yeah, you see, they also went to the Mediterranean. They also went to the Mediterranean. But funnily enough, this the trajectory there is very different from the Central European basin. In fact, the population here in Eastern Central Europe has genetically the closest resemblances to Eastern Anatolia today and to Inner Sardinia. That's where they are, you know, Inner Sardinia was very isolated over the millennia. So, you know, this is where these farmers came as a closed group at that time. So I thought this might be of interest. And it was easier for me to...
Okay.
That's another component, I admit.
Comments coming up?
Excuse me, forgive my ignorance. I understand that the origin of the European people is from the Eastern Anatolia. It's coming from the Eastern Anatolia. And also the farming and domestication animal began in the year 9000 before Christ. And also I noticed that there was another civilization in Mongolia and dating to back to 20,000 before Christ. Is that right?
It's not a civilization, it's hunting and gathering populations.
But they were making potteries.
They were making certain kinds of stones,
Stones.
which from then they are dispersed all over Eurasia and into North America with the first people.
That is the ancestors of the Indians in the United States, in America, yes.
Parts of them, yes.
Yeah.
Parts of them.
I wanted to be sure about what I heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If there are no